Welcome to all of you. I see we have hundreds of people here today. Just by way of what we're going to do here, we'll give each one of our research presenters just about 3 to 5 minutes to give an overview of the top lines of their projects. And then I'm going to give them a couple of questions to start things off. I think probably by, maybe about 20 or to 30 minutes, we'll be open up for questions. So please just go ahead and type your questions in as they occur to you, and I'll hope to get to all of them or get to as many of them as possible. I think it's important for us to note that during this crisis and this pandemic, none of these things were obviously things that were started by the government, or for the most part, they are nevertheless important in terms of the type of response that the government, in this case, the United States government, is engaging in. And so our authors today, our scholars today, are going to talk about how it is that the government is performing. And this is both true at the federal level and the bureaucracy of the CDC. And also Professor Grose is going to be talking about the ways in which elected officials are responding, in this case, local elected officials, who take care of elections at the county level in the American states. So if there was ever a great lesson in federalism, this is it. Elections are conducted in the United States at local levels and state levels, not at the federal level, even when they are federal elections. So let's kick it off and begin, Christian, by asking you to tell us a little bit about the survey of local election officials that you conducted between March and May of this year. Not coincidentally, you added questions on coronavirus, but you were not originally attempting to bring this systematic research to bear. So can you tell us a little bit about the study that you did?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Professor Junn, and it's just really exciting to be here with you as one of my favorite colleagues, and with Nico, who's just one of my favorite students, and it's going to be a fun discussion. And I also just want to thank Dean Miller and everybody else for making this happen at Dornsife. This study is about local election officials and what they are doing given coronavirus. As you mentioned, the study began as something else and is another project that I'm going to be looking at with a student who recently completed his studies at USC on post-election audits. But this particular component just happened to be that we were fielding a survey of local election officials. And these are people who are at the county level in most states, sometimes are town or city level. Some of them are appointed, some of them are elected, but they're basically the essential workers of democracy. They're the ones that run the elections, right? So if you're here in Los Angeles County, this is Dean Logan, who runs the elections in Los Angeles County. If you're in Orange County, California, this is Neil Kelly, who runs the elections in Orange County. And there's someone like this all across the country, and the survey was of people like that, to try to just get a sense of what are they doing around coronavirus, what preparations are they taking, and are they concerned that the coronavirus could actually deter turnout. Some of the key top lines would just, in the survey, I just asked, are you doing anything? The survey, by the way, was done from March through April 2020. It had over 800 different local election officials responded to the survey. But the main question was, are you doing anything to respond to coronavirus? And 75% of local election officials are doing something. 25% are not doing anything, or at least they weren't at the time that we asked the questions. And then I think more importantly, we asked them, what are they doing? What steps are they taking to mitigate coronavirus around the election? And this, we just asked them an open-ended question. What are the things that you're trying to do? So what practices are you engaging in? And they varied a lot, right? So a lot of the officials are doing something, 3/4 of them are doing something, but what they're doing is really different. And I think we have this in a word cloud. I created a word cloud of what the officials said. So here you can see the larger words represent things that were mentioned more frequently by local election officials all over the country. Smaller words indicate those that were mentioned but mentioned less. And so there's a couple different categories I want to point you to. There's absentee voting, vote by mail. We've heard a ton about that in the news. President Trump tweeted about it today, getting into a little bit of a back and forth with the Secretary of States of Nevada and Michigan. But there's also a lot of things that are about preparation, having hand sanitizer, protect PPE for workers, poll workers, and then there's a lot about social distancing. And so if you look at this and break it down, there's the 5 most common things that local election officials are engaging in right now are, number 1 is distancing measures for voters. So 44% of local election officials said that they're taking distancing. They're trying to engage in social distancing at the polls. The number two thing that's being done is PPE, sanitizers, and hygiene measures that are being implemented for poll workers. So I think that's an interesting distinction, the workers versus the focus on the voters. You probably need to do both to have the elections run well. Number three, 38% are increasing or encouraging absentee voting or vote by mail. And we're seeing a lot of that at the state level. And so this is the local level where some of these officials don't have the discretion necessarily to implement vote by mail if their states don't already have it, but they are encouraging absentee or vote by mail in their local jurisdictions. Number four, 10% of people said they wanted to postpone elections. So completely different than those first three in some ways. And with some primaries, they have been postponed and moved to other times. And then the number five thing that local election officials are doing the most is hiring more poll or election workers where financially feasible to assist with all of those things. Having more workers would do that. And we'll get into this in Q&A if people want to, but on balance, most of these officials are nonpartisan positions. They're not, they may have partisan leanings, but they're not Republicans or Democrats. But those who are Republicans and those who are Democrats, large majorities of them are all supportive of distancing and absentee voting or vote by mail. Democratic officials tended to favor hiring workers more frequently. Republicans tended to favor encouraging absentee voting in contrast to the president or postponing elections.
Great, thank you, Christian. That's fascinating. And I think we've had a request for you to repeat those in a few moments. And maybe let's go through with the top lines for Nico's study about the CDC. And if you could be prepared to do that, that would be excellent. Thank you. So Nico, you recently did a study that was in fact profiled in the Washington Post. You authored a piece in the Washington Post about this. And I just need to remind you all that Nico is only a second-year graduate student in our PhD program. So hats off to you, Nico. Please provide a little bit of an explanation about how it is, what kind of research you've done, and the results you had about how the CDC has recently spent almost $1 billion that it was allocated to it in March to fight coronavirus.
Right, thank you. So I also would like to thank Dean Miller, Jane, and Christian, and Dornsife generally for holding this. I think it's a really great opportunity for us to share some of our research that's really important to talk about given all that's going on. So like Jane said, the research that I conducted was looking at how the CDC spent almost $1 billion of taxpayer money in March to combat the coronavirus. So in March, there was a really pressing demand for Congress to do something about the coronavirus. There were calls for them to respond by giving, PPE and laboratory money for laboratories to states, and then money to send. They were also told to send money to individuals, right, to help them deal with the coronavirus pandemic. So on March 6th, Congress passed a law that appropriated about $1 billion to the CDC and told them to spend it as they saw fit in a way that would benefit the most people to help combat the coronavirus. When agencies are tasked with spending this much money, there's always a worry that the spending is going to be politicized. And by that I mean it's going to go to individuals, states, and corporations that benefit a certain political party, certain political actors, or in any other way that doesn't actually achieve the goal that was that the money was supposed to do. So I was able to get data on where the CDC spent, those almost $1 billion, and look at how that money was distributed. And the good news is that the money was distributed pretty perfectly aligned with state population, meaning that states that have more population, New York, Florida, Texas, were given more money as they have greater need for money and equipment to handle coronavirus. And then if you look at how the money was spent and compare it to, for example, Trump's 2016 vote share in states, there's no relationship at all. So states like Massachusetts, which voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton, received about the same in funding per capita as Arkansas, which voted overwhelmingly for Trump. So there's kind of little worry that at least that first round of funding from the CDC was politicized and went in ways that were inefficient or that benefited certain political actors in the federal government.
Great, thank you, Nico. Just one quick follow-up to that. Say a little bit about how the CDC director is appointed and any confirmation process. And there is a little bit of news out today about the possibility that Redfield's job is a bit in danger.
Right, so the CDC director is appointed without Senate confirmation, which means that he or she serves at the pleasure of the president, which means that they can be fired at any time without cause. And that's one of the reasons why we might be concerned that the money would be spent in ways that are unfair or that benefit Trump. If the director feels pressure, if he feels like he'll be fired if he doesn't do what a certain political party or political actor wants, they might disperse the money in ways that benefit that political actor. So, despite the potential issue there with Robert Redfield being appointed and being able to be removed by President Trump, that pressure doesn't seem to have affected the way that these funds were distributed.
Great, thanks. And just one more quick one, and then I think we'll move back to Christian's findings and results from this fascinating study. But is the CDC unique here? So this goes at your results, I think, are a very good example of how it is that systematic research systematic academic research can really bring to bear implications of what it is that's happening at present. And it's a nonpartisan, obviously, study. But what is it about the CDC that is unique? Is it typical? So would you expect to see a similar pattern of the distribution of funding in other executive agencies in particular that are charged with dispersing funds?
Sure. So I think that in some ways the CDC has been unique in its response, not just now to coronavirus, but historically, the way that federal agencies have distributed money has tended to favor the party of whoever the president is. One reason the CDC may be able to resist these pressures is that it's at its core a professional organization. It's a group of highly educated policy experts with masters in public health, PhDs, medical degrees, who probably have the best idea out of any of us what the best way to spend money is. And other agencies don't necessarily have that same expertise, or they've been overrun with political appointees that make it hard for the people who do have expertise to do their jobs. A great example of this that's been demonstrated kind of historically and contemporarily is FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So they have one of the highest proportions of political appointees to careerists. And we see kind of the effects of that. If you think about the response to Hurricane Katrina or responses to other hurricanes or natural disasters, where the response has been perhaps not as good as we would have wanted. So the CDC is relatively insulated in that it doesn't have many political appointees. It's full of a lot of experts and professionals who are really motivated to do the right thing.
Okay, great. And I just one more, Christian, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a question from an attendee who asked whether or not, and the extent to which Senate confirmation would change the position significantly. And since a CDC director is appointed and could be fired, is there a better option?
Yes, that's a good question. Part of whether Senate confirmation would matter depends on the partisan composition of the federal government. So right now, Republicans control the Senate, so it's unlikely that the Senate would have moderated in any way, who gets selected to be the director of the CDC. But that being said, the insulation that comes with Senate confirmation, meaning they can't be unilaterally removed by the president, will give that agency some degree of independence to pursue, goals that aren't necessarily subject to the whims of the political winds at any given time.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Nico. We'll come back to Nico in a moment, and I'll also please continue to send your questions, post them to the Q&A window. Christian, let's go back to you, and let's talk a little bit about dig a little bit deeper into the results. And there are a lot of good questions already, but of course, I'm taking the moderator's prerogative and asking you one on my own. You mentioned at least a couple of ways in which election officials, that is to say local election administrators and officials, are responding. And in particular, you talked about both whether or not they are concerned about turnout and what they are doing to prepare for it. I noticed in some of the earlier results that there were differences in terms of party, but as well as by the sex of the officials. So can you say a little bit more? So in other words, women and men officials at this level of government, are there differences between party as well as by sex, and then also by region as well? Before you answer that, would you mind please responding to a request from the audience that you repeat those the main findings that you began with?
Sure. Yeah. So just to reiterate, So when asked, what are you doing to address coronavirus concerns with your elections, the top 5 responses in an open-ended question. Open-ended means they were able to answer anything they wanted to. Local officials said engaging in social distancing measures for voters, providing PPE, sanitizers, and other hygiene measures for workers, increasing or encouraging greater absentee or vote by mail, postponing elections, and hiring more poll or election workers were the top 5 types of things that people are engaging in. Yeah, and your question, Jen, it's really interesting because there are some pretty big differences across both gender and party. With the partisan differences, I want to be a little bit hesitant because so many of these local election officials are nonpartisan positions. So, but some of them are partisans, and we can compare nonpartisan Republican and Democratic officials. And in general, more than 70% of Republican local elected officials are concerned and taking actions around COVID-19 preparation for their polls in November. Among Democrats, it's a little bit higher. It's almost 80%, but that's still, really large majorities of Republicans and Democrats at the local level are making efforts. By region, we've got a little bit of difference that I think is fascinating. In the West, 92% of local officials are reporting that they're taking some sort of action around coronavirus. And then the lowest region is the Midwest. The South and the Northeast are using the 4 census categories. Midwestern local elected officials have taken the least actions. And part of this is due to where the cases and the deaths are occurring. Right, if you look at the county and the state level incidence rates, the people who are most concerned in taking preparations correlates pretty highly where the bad things are happening. And so that part of these regional and partisan differences also break down to where the worst cases are and how many cases we have. One really fascinating thing is with gender. Gender jumps out. First of all, more of these local election officials are female than male who answered the survey, and women are more likely to be engaging in distancing measures for voters, meaning making preparations to engage in distancing, and compared to the male local election officials by about 10 percentage points more. Women local election officials are also taking more actions to protect workers around personal protective equipment and other measures. And then men, interestingly, are more likely to support postponing elections relative to the female local election officials. So there are some interesting gender dynamics among these decision makers.
Thank you, Christian. That's great. Just one quick thing, and I'm sure there will be some more follow-up questions to that, but I'd just like you to say for a moment, just talk about the study design here, because someone asked whether or not, I think this is Mark asked whether or not these results can be extrapolated to the national scene. And I wrote back saying that these are local officials, which when aggregated, make up the national scene. So tell us a little bit about that. So how are you drawing inferences from across the whole country based on your study?
Sure. This is a survey of local officials, and so most of them are at the county level, but there's usually one person per county, or in some states like Wisconsin, the elections are administered also at the town or the town level. So it's below the county, but this is a national sample of officials across the entire United States. So we are able to extrapolate about what's working and what's not working in the entire country by looking at the differences that are being what's being done at the local level.
Okay, great. Thank you. And just following up, then we have a question from Jason on this in particular. Did you ask them about their own partisanship? I think the answer to that is yes. And are those gender differences related to partisanship, or is it something else? And if it's something else, or in addition, what is that?
Yeah, I did ask them about their own partisanship, and as you might expect, a lot of nonpartisan officials who administer elections don't really like that question, and many of them said they preferred not to answer that question. And so there's not a lot of data on partisan leanings of these elected officials who really go above and beyond to try to be as nonpartisan as possible. Those who are partisan officials indicated their partisanship. Some of the nonpartisan officials also indicated their partisanship, but I'm hesitant to read too much into that, given that so many of the nonpartisan officials didn't want to answer that question, which I think is a fair and reasonable thing. On gender, there could be a number of reasons, and it'd be interesting to hear what Jane has to think about this too, because she's an expert on gender and politics herself. But in general, women local election officials might be thinking more about risk in ways that differ from the male local officials. There's a lot of research showing that women in general are a bit more risk averse around things like decision making than men are, and so this could be part of what's going on. If you're more risk averse, you might be thinking about being more prepared. There's about a potential health crisis. I don't know, Jane, what do you think?
I think that's possible. I mean, elected officials are different because they're elites as compared to ordinary American voters. But I think there's some really interesting stuff from a recent Washington Post poll, things I'm working on with a couple of other graduate students at USC, regarding how women are much more afraid than men of contracting the virus, and also about half as likely to say that they are confident and feel good about going out to places like restaurants and movie theaters and retail shops. So those are probably consistent then also with this behavior. If we can just maybe add on to this one, I have a question from Ange Marie, who wanted to know about a couple of things with respect to poll workers. How do we think about poll workers in high-risk categories in terms of what it is that they're compensated, how they're compensated? And would it make it harder to recruit poll workers, and might there be a lot of turnover? And I think this is also implicated in gender. Most of the larger share of poll workers tend to be women, older, more senior citizen level women, as well as men, but more women. So she's curious about how poll workers in high-risk categories, what is going to happen to them, and will it make it harder to recruit poll workers if we're still doing elections in person?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is Ange Marie Hancock Alfaro, who is in the Political Science and International Relations Department and the Gender Studies Department here at USC Dornsife. So thanks for the question and thanks for coming. The poll workers, protecting the poll workers was one of the things that came up the most in the general responses. And I think that if you look at what the election administrators were saying, they were really divided into thinking about poll workers' safety and the ability to get poll workers in their responses, and then protecting voters. There is one interesting partisan breakdown among the Democratic and the Republican elected officials. The Democratic elected officials, or excuse me, not elected, the Democratic officials, because many of them are appointed to, the Democratic local administrators were much more focused on protecting the voters in their responses. They were much more focused on vote by mail, while the Republican administrators were more focused on the workers and protecting the workers. And so this could be related to age. And a number of them even said that they, in their own jurisdictions, they are getting new workers to replace those who are at greatest risk due to their own health issues. Because so many of them are senior citizens and advanced age and at a higher risk in general, that came up over and over. The problem is the solution isn't obvious for how to do it, right? And this is where there's another partisan divide among the Democratic officials compared to the Republican officials. While the Republican officials were more focused on protecting the workers at the polling places, the Democratic officials were more concerned about hiring more workers, as you might expect, right? Sort of a spending decision. It's going to be more costly to do that, while the just protection for workers without necessarily doing the expenditures was something that the Republican officials were thinking about. And also find those partisan differences really interesting, because the national conversation is about Trump versus Congress and this highly uber polarized environment. But what's going on with the local officials on the ground is that Republicans and Democrats really are concerned about coronavirus, but they're focusing on different strategies, right? They're focused on really different things in terms of what they think will help, what they think will help with turnout and with the election. And what's also interesting is we'll be able to evaluate those strategies. One thing I'd like to do in the future that I don't have the resources for right now is to evaluate which of these strategies is working best, right? I have a little bit of data on that I can talk about in terms of the survey, but it'd be really nice to track these differences across the states and the localities and see, has that made a difference for reducing cases of coronavirus, reducing deaths of coronavirus in these localities?
That's great. Thank you, Christian. I'll just push you just a tiny bit more on data, and then I'm going to return to a question for Nico. This is, I'm just curious as to, let me find this question again. This is from Ashish. Wondering whether or not the election officials, as you mentioned, it's a relatively small proportion. It's 30%, a little less than 30%, depending on party. For those election officials, Ashish asks, for those election officials who answered that they were not taking action to prepare for the pandemic, did they provide an explanation as to why? Was there a pattern in terms of the type of election officials who responded with that answer? You've described a little bit of that, but more than, did they tell you why they're not preparing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they didn't explicitly answer that in an open-ended question, because when we asked if you're not preparing, we didn't ask them how, but perhaps we should have asked them why not. But that's a great question. But we did look at things that are associated with them not preparing, and the thing that jumped out to me the most, there's no major partisan difference. There's no major gender difference. There were little ones that we've talked about, but it's, we're not talking about 50-point gaps or 40-point gaps or anything. The biggest thing was the incidence of coronavirus, right? So if they are officials in counties that were basically relatively untouched by coronavirus, they were less likely to be concerned about it. And so I also think that informs our national conversation about this, right? Where people who think certain officials aren't doing enough, and then others think that they're doing too much. I think a lot of it does seem to be where you're sitting, right? What's going on the ground where you are locally from an election administration standpoint might suggest how concerned you are or are not. So I think that was one of the biggest factors for why someone said they weren't concerned. Also think, if we continued this survey through May, there's some of those people that said they weren't concerned in March and April may be concerned now. So we also need to just remember the timing of the survey too as one possible reason.
So that would be great if you could continue to do more of this research and continue these surveys and results. I'm sorry, just one last question from also someone from the audience, and this is from Christian, also a faculty member in our department, asking you whether or not there were any differences in terms of election access measures among the former Section 5, that is to say the preclearance locations, jurisdictions, and if they have implemented new voter ID measures since Shelby County. That's the United States Supreme Court decision. What year is it? Is it 12, 13 on the Voting Rights Act and preclearance? So were there any differences in terms of election access measures among those former Section 5 locations?
Yeah, thanks. This is Christian Phillips. There are two Christians in the Political Science and International Relations Department at USC. And so thank you also, Christian, for taking part in this. That's a really good question. I didn't look into that in detail. I think that's something to go forward on in the future. Just sort of more top line results for, so the Voting Rights Act is to protect, for those who aren't familiar, some of it was thrown out by a court decision a few years ago, but a lot of it still remains nationally to protect voting rights of people of color and especially in areas where there's racially polarized voting. So it's something that's worth looking at. I did look at the race and ethnicity of the local election administrator who took the survey and compared whites to those who identified as not white. The sample sizes weren't large enough to go into greater detail than that. But among non-white local election administrators, just over 80% of them were concerned about voter turnout among getting lower due to coronavirus. And then among white election administrators, they were also concerned, rates at 70% or higher, but about a 10 percentage point lower rate of concern for that. So there's a little bit of a race and ethnicity story going on at that official level, but that's a great idea to study more in the future.
I also just want to finally mention that John would like to see a follow-up survey for possible changes. So get to work, Christian. All right, great. Thank you for now. Nico, let's move on to, we have a question from Frank about the relationship between, American voters and confidence in the CDC. And I'm not sure that your research in particular was directed at uncovering the answer to this, but he asks whether or not public confidence in the CDC and other agencies has it decreased or increased. And in particular, he wants to know to what extent, if any, does the media have a role in either undermining or promoting confidence, in particular, a narrative forwarded by politicians that could politicize the disbursement of funds? That's a USC student question, by the way, I'll just have you know.
Right. So I haven't done any independent research on public perceptions or approval of the CDC, but around the time that I was doing the research that I talked about today, two political scientists, one of whom is Bethany Albertson at UT Austin, did a poll of citizens asking them who they want to be the face of the federal government's response to coronavirus. And kind of at the top was the CDC and Dr. Fauci. So I think that perceptions of the CDC are relatively high as far as perceptions of government go. Approval of almost every government institution in the federal government is pretty low. But approval of the CDC has been pretty high. I don't know if it's changed dramatically in the past couple weeks or months. I think that's a really interesting, outstanding question. I'm sure there are people who are doing polls on this. But I think the media also has a big role to play here. It's easy to talk about the doomsday findings about coronavirus, about the number of cases and things that went wrong in the early stages. But I think that that might change the way that people perceive the CDC. But I think there are also a lot of kind of good responses that are happening.
Great. And I guess one of the things I'm wondering is maybe you might talk a little bit more about who exactly is making the decisions inside of the CDC. Are you privy to that kind of information? Would there be a way to ascertain who is making the decisions about, let's say, the distribution of funds in the most recent March $1 billion set of funding to states?
So they haven't released what their decision-making process was. These are things that are FOIA-able, though, so you can file a Freedom of Information request. So if there are any attorneys out there who would like to file FOIA requests, that'd be great. So no, we don't know right now what their exact criteria were. The Department of Health and Human Services, which is the parent department of the CDC, does have information about this that a watchdog group just sent a FOIA out for. So hopefully we'll have more information soon about what the decision-making process was. But with this kind of really quick call to action that Congress gave CDC, it's likely that it was done by civil servants or careerists in the agency.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nico. Keep the questions coming. I have quite a lot to go through, and I'm going to change tack just a little bit here. I'd like to go to a couple of things. Let's start with an application so in other words, what might be an implication of what is going on here? And in particular, when we think about turnout and then mobilization to turnout, we have a question from Max, who was also a former USC student. Hello, Max. I would like to read you his question. And this is an implication with respect to, I believe this is the election for the 25th district in California's, and this is to replace Katie Hill. Max asked the following: do you have any takeaways from last week's special in the 25th, where the Republicans flipped the seat, and this is a first perhaps in California over 20 years, with a surprisingly high turnout in the GOP win? And so what he's wondering is, does this offer an early clue of COVID-19 political implications heading into 2020? Either of you, I think, could respond to this.
Well, first, I just want to say hi, Max. This is one of the nice things about doing these virtual seminars is you get to connect with old students. And so it's really, well, you're not that old, but like former students. And so that's really nice to hear from all these people and see the questions from colleagues and students and interested policymakers here. But on California 25, that was a really huge special election because, California has trended so Democratic over the last decade or so. And it was a seat that had flipped from the Republicans to the Democrats when Katie Hill won. And then in the special election, Mike Garcia, a Republican, defeated Democrat Christy Smith. And so what's going on there. I think I'm hesitant to read too much into it for some national or statewide implication, or even a coronavirus implication. I will say coronavirus made it harder to campaign. It made it harder for Democrats in particular to mobilize. Democrats do a really good job going door to door, knocking on people's door to mobilize and getting them out to vote. Republicans, I think, use different strategies to mobilize voters. And I think Republicans in that district in particular did a really good job of mobilizing their voters and even registering new voters. I also think that that particular candidate is a little bit different than some other Republican candidates that have run that are a little bit more extreme, and have failed to win in other contexts. So I think that's part of what's going on. But coronavirus might have made a difference. Historically, also in California special elections, Republicans turn out at higher rates than Democrats do. So I think if you think about November, the same people will be running against each other. Garcia, the Republican, has to really watch it, because in a mobilized presidential year election, there may be a lot more Democrats voting than they did in the special.
Great. Nico, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think I'll echo most of what Christian said. It's tempting to read into all political events that are going on now. Something they're being driven in some part by coronavirus, but I think that kind of these pre-existing trends that Christian talked about are probably the likeliest explanation for why we saw what we saw.
Okay, great. Thank you both, and thank you for the questions. Keep them coming. We don't have too much more time, but I think that if we continue to have as many questions and the conversation keeps going, I think we can continue on a few extra minutes. For those of you, obviously, drop off whenever you need to. Let's take a slightly different tack now, because I would like to be able to cover this question about an evaluation. So I'm asking you to evaluate one of the things that started this webinar in the first place, and that motivating question is, are government officials doing the right thing? Are they making the right decisions in this time of pandemic? And I'm sure there are a lot of different ways to approach this question, but I'd like to bring in a couple of people who have raised questions. They include Justin as well as Teresa, two of the first questions that came in. Teresa asked the following. She writes that people are afraid because they do not experience a cohesive and strategic plan from government, and instead they see confusion and conflicting ideas, plans, suggestions, and contradictions to sometimes what medical officers are advising. So she asks a general question about what should voters, be asking and demanding of their leaders as we move forward? That's a big question, but I'll pose that to both of you, or either of you would like to answer that.
No, Nico, you wanna start?
Sure. I think one kind of unsatisfying thing about the way the United States government works is that it was created, all of these different agencies were created in a patchwork, right? It's not like somebody sat down and said, this is what we want the federal government to look like. It's going to work in this unitary way, and we're going to get what we want. The politics of the era when all of these different agencies and programs were created really are unique. So we're left with this patchwork of agencies that sometimes doesn't work together because they represent completely different periods in American history and different coalitions that enacted them. So I think one of the things that we might press our public officials to do is think about ways to start unifying, the way that our federal government works. Think about ways to encourage interagency cooperation, cooperation between the federal and state governments, things like that, I think would be useful.
Okay, very
good.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just a great question, and it's hard for voters to figure out who do you blame and who do you credit for making the right decisions and for making the wrong decisions? Do you blame the president? Do you blame the agencies that Nico is studying? Do you blame local officials that I'm studying? Do you blame state officials like governors? Do you blame the elected people, the people who are appointed, who are experts, or who are politicos that don't have as much expertise? It's really hard to evaluate, even if somebody who studies this, let alone just as a voter, who do you hold accountable and who's doing the right thing, who's making the right decision? So, I think a lot of attention goes to the president, but and then in a national crisis, national decision making is really important. The president is the president is important. I have some political memorabilia behind me. I don't think you can see it. I have the buck stops here, as Harry Truman said, is one of the things behind me. The president is one of the people that we can evaluate relatively easily, and there's a presidential election, and this is going to be a huge issue in the November election, and how people evaluate him is going to make a difference for if it's Biden or Trump. And I also think if you watch a lot of what Trump is doing right now, he's trying to focus attention on agency decision making, mistakes that agencies have made, using the bureaucracy as a tool to say, this is something they should have told me about, and if I'd only known earlier, or even deflecting blame to the states and localities by allowing the states to be doing so much. That's part of what's going on. So really good literature around blame avoidance in government that finds that, you know, voters reward people for making the wrong decisions. They don't reward elected officials for making the right decisions that no one notices. So whenever we're not in a pandemic, no one rewards those elected officials for that. Right, like in California, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was governor, was concerned about a pandemic, opened up a whole bunch of new hospitals, hired a bunch of people, got a bunch of PPE. Hardly anyone knows about that because there was no pandemic after all, because the preparations were made. But now we're in the middle of one. And so everyone's like, do you blame the governor? Do you blame Newsom? Do you blame the president? And a lot of that's really hard to figure out. The one thing I'll just conclude with is, I'm just kind of going on about this. You know, if I bring it back to the study that I did, the local election officials, I think, both the elected and the appointed ones, I think, need guidance from the their states, and then in particular, and they also could use guidance from the national government. But they are doing, based on the survey results, really good work that I think they are making the right decisions. I think, you know, they're making different types of decisions in terms of what they think is more important: protecting workers, protecting voters, vote by mail versus social distancing strategies. But I think they're really thinking about it and they care about it. And then it seems to be the case with a lot of the people in the CDC too, right? The experts, Jane mentioned this to begin with. One of the great things about expertise, you know, we're at a university where we value expertise. You know, we are experts who spend time thinking about things. Not because people necessarily follow our policy advice, but because hopefully sometimes some elected officials will follow the policy advice of the experts.
Great, thank you both for that. And a couple of just quick comments I want to note is Lydia mentions that it's just hard to figure out who to blame, in part because we have no good benchmarks. And even at the state level, the benchmarks keep moving. I think that's a very astute comment. And Keith then notes that attitudes toward government and elected officials do not handle uncertainty well. I mean, this is extremely uncertain times, as he notes, a 100-year event with evolving information, and therefore the variance in the decisions are just highly likely. So political winners out of this pandemic may just be lucky. That remains to be seen. We have a long way to go. Just a quick note also from Michael that 25 is up again. District 25 is up again for election in November. So that recent special that just occurred was to finish the rest of Katie Hill's term. But as Christian Grose noted, they will rerun this election for the general to replace whoever the person who's in it now, Garcia, for the following Congress. Just a quick shout out to Stephen, Dornsife 2013, and David, School of International Relations in Dornsife 2007. Thank you for coming. Keep the good questions coming. Let's move on to something a little bit different, but it's really important, and there are a number of different questions. So I've kind of put them all together, and they are from a series of people, including Justin, David, let's see, and others. Forgive me for not getting all of your names in here. People have asked really about how serious is election fraud? Is this something that we need to be concerned about? I mean, there is, the president has noted that voter fraud is a problem, which is part of the reason why he doesn't like the idea of mail-in ballots. How much of a problem is that really? Question to both of you. How is it that you might secure online voting? And furthermore, what are the other options? Are there other options besides these two? And how serious do you think it might be, this notion of postponing elections, other than the primary, of course? Most of those are over, but in addition, just the general election. So, so for example, could we move to, David asked, could we move to online voting? Would either party be opposed to this? Sorry, that's a lot. Go ahead.
Nico, you wanna say?
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of the question one more time? Sorry.
Well, just that is there, maybe you could take the question about election fraud. Is that
Sure.
voter fraud? Is that a big thing?
No. So there was recently a study in the American Political Science Review, which is kind of the leading journal in political science, and they analyzed voter files, which is individual level data on who voted. It doesn't tell you how they voted, but you know whether they voted, and it can be linked up with census data and all sorts of other things. And the incidences of dual voting, one kind of voter fraud where the same person votes twice, is minuscule. So I think it's not an issue.
Yeah, I would concur that the incidence of that happening is really low. I think what's more interesting is that question about online voting and other forms of voting. You know, the coronavirus is being used to raise all sorts of possibilities of new voting methods. There's been massive increases in vote by mail across the country. Right, a decision in Texas yesterday is going to allow vote by mail. There have been moves for online voting. I do think online voting, there's been some research on it by political scientists, but there's a little bit of security concerns still that I think exist that have to be considered. In online voting, there's probably greater security concerns there than there is in traditional voting and vote by mail. The likelihood of voter fraud in a traditional vote by mail system is much lower than there probably would be online.
Oh, great. Okay, so then just in response, Taylor asked the question of whether or not any of the officials that you surveyed had discussed or even considered the online voting as a possibility.
So we in the survey we didn't ask about that in the survey, so I don't know in terms of an explicit response. In terms of the open-ended responses, is that something they're considering? That was not one of the top 15 responses that came up.
Okay, good. All right, what do you think, I guess this could be for either of you, but what happens, this is from Shani, what happens to all the resources, services, and providers and agencies that are now being created once the pandemic is over? So will elected officials be motivated to continue funding for resources for possible future emergencies? Is this like a one-time thing, or do you see a systematic change in the administration of elections and in the bureaucracy at either the federal or at state levels to deal with additional potential issues? Like, for example, it doesn't have to be a pandemic, but it could be a natural disaster. Good question from Shani.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that a lot of things are going to go back to quote normal after a while in terms of the way elections have been administered, but I think a lot of things are not. I think this has been a real shift to the system where there's now new, if voters start getting used to voting by mail and they like voting by mail as an option, that's something that might continue. I do think that it's important to know that no particular policy outcome is a panacea, right? Like, so being only vote by mail could potentially be a problem without offering other places to vote in person, because certain groups, in particular Latino voters, according to some research by Professor Mindy Romero, who's here at USC, shows that there's Latino voters vote in person more frequently than vote by mail, at least in California. So I think that these new systems will be here to stay, but we also need to keep some of the older systems in place for a variety of reasons to protect voting rights. I also think that the coronavirus is being used in a dismal way. It's already dismal enough to read the health headlines, but from a democracy standpoint, people are engaging in partisan and electoral motivations around coronavirus, claiming that it's due to coronavirus, but they're making changes that might stick for a long time that actually are just to help them with their own elections and help them get reelected. And the coronavirus is just an excuse to make these changes.
Okay, do you think can someone talk maybe just a bit about pros and cons of postponing elections? I mean, is this something that we could postpone a little bit longer, maybe December, or I'm not sure beyond that, but what are some of the pros and cons? You just give the pluses and minuses postponing elections.
I think one of the major cons is that turnout already is kind of lower than we probably as a society would like. And when elections are moved, turnout is going to drop even more. So I think there is issues there with uncertainty about when elections are going to be held. The legitimacy of certain elections might be called into question. I think the main issues are going to be people's perceptions of the United States as a democratic country. Yeah.
Okay, great. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I encourage those of you who want to stay, please stay. I think Christian and Nico are willing to stick around for about 10 more minutes. There are some, if not technical questions about the study in particular. I'm just going to read them, Christian, and I wonder if there's a way that you could post these or add them in a document to accompany. People are interested in the study itself, and so David is interested in differences between officials in heavily populated metro counties versus small rural counties. And I think that's relevant with respect to maybe your answer about where the COVID epidemic had been more intense. John asked about breakdowns in terms of needing or wanting more resources to help in the selection by party, gender, geography, other differences. I think that's also an important question. And then Sam asks about response rate and demographic representation of your election administration sample. This also goes to the question of whether or not you have more women responding to your study. Are they just more conscientious in responding, or are there actually more women administering elections at the local level? I think maybe if we could maybe move on to, and I would hope, Christian, if you could post that information or provide it, that Dornsife Communications will help to provide maybe a top lines for you.
Yeah, and also I'm happy to, if people want to email me individually, I'm happy to respond to specific things about the survey.
Okay, great. I just want to read one thing from Vicky, who notes that she is a new citizen, and she hopes that there'll be more dialogue like this because we need to hear from experts, not politicians. She says, I'm a new citizen and this will be my first presidential vote. I'm educating myself to make my best decision. I am prepared then for any eventuality. So thank you, Vicky, for noting that. Melissa notes that you can't postpone a presidential election. Certainly that is true without congressional action. That is right. Last thing, maybe if you guys could answer the question and just in general think about what is going to happen. Two states that are in the news today, that's Michigan and Nevada. Bill asks if you have broad thoughts about the coming showdown over vote by mail, because it's not just Michigan and Nevada, as he notes, but he does highlight for us that Trump tweeted today about both Michigan and Nevada expanding opportunities for vote by mail. That he also talks about a district court in Texas upholding absentee voting for its primary this summer. Fifth Circuit has already issued a stay against this. So what are your thoughts about what will happen on this controversy about voting by mail?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be huge. It's going to dominate our discussion between now and November, and it's one of the key things. It is not the only thing we need to be doing to if you're trying to protect elections around coronavirus, but it is one key strategy that can be used. And I think the Michigan Secretary of State is I'm biased because she was a professor like me before she became the Secretary of State. So I think she's a fairly evidence-based elected official of a number of the elected officials who are out there. So I would look at her as an example of somebody who's doing a really good job bringing evidence to bear when making decisions about how to administer elections. And so I don't think that's probably the person that the president should be getting in an argument with, but it may be helpful politically. But I think she's had a lot of really creative and innovative ways to bring things to election administration that I haven't seen with other elected officials. I'm less familiar with Nevada. The other thing I want to mention on Trump and Trump sort of getting into this argument with state elected officials is going back to my survey. The local elected officials who are Republicans in the survey were one of the strategies Republicans were more likely than Democratic election administrators to say they were trying to engage in is encouraging greater absentee voting. Studies in political science show that absentee voting actually can help Republicans quite a bit, or will often have no partisan impact one way or the other. Both Republicans and Democrats will mobilize their supporters via absentee votes or vote by mail. So the controversy is interesting because part of me thinks whenever there's a controversy and a particular elected official, in this case the president or a particular party, likes one election method and the other one likes the other, usually that means that it does favor one party or the other. They wouldn't be that bothered by it if that weren't true, but a lot of the evidence suggests that absentee ballots are favored by Republican officials at the local level, could help both Republicans and Democrats, and so I think vote by mail is perhaps less of a partisan issue than it's being portrayed right now by the president.
Nico, did you want to address that?
No, I don't think I have anything to add. I agree with everything Christian said.
Okay, great. There are a couple more things. I did want to just talk to, I mean, there's still a lot of people here, a couple hundred people still on the line, and you have so many good questions. I'm just afraid we can't get to all of them, but I do think that we are, in many ways, as scholars and academics, at your service in terms of when you have questions and you really want to know more of like the questions that have been raised and the answers that have been provided through this very systematic and important academic research. It would be wonderful if you could address them to us, and perhaps we could find another way, schedule another webinar to answer those questions. I mean, some of the things that I'm most interested in are when do and how is it that coronavirus is going to affect how people vote? So will they hold? This was in part in much of the commentary from earlier, but will they discuss and will it make a difference? Who will they hold accountable? But in particular, if women are much more likely to find coronavirus a threat and something to worry about, will they hold the president accountable? Will more women defect from the Republican Party and move away from the president and toward a different candidate, a new candidate? I think that's one of the more interesting questions. We have a number of experts in the political science and gender studies departments here at USC that could speak to that question. And I encourage all of you who are listening and still participating in this webinar, if you have other items, please send them on. Finally, I did want to raise this one, and maybe I'll just give you one or two more. And this is from Stephen, and with respect specifically to the 2020 election, what are some of the most effective ways to mitigate voter suppression tactics that could be deployed? And this is also, I'd like to add on to that a question from Tulu about how it is that election administration officials can accommodate marginalized populations, such as people with disabilities, when they vote by mail. And so I think that what we're asking here, these questions are asking, is how to maximize the opportunity for the most fundamental right in American democracy, and that is to cast a ballot.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is extremely important. On disability and voting rights, there's there are requirements, federal and state requirements to ensure that's considered, and I do think there are, in this sort of new frontier of massive and quick changes to voting systems, there's going to be a lot of evaluation of how does this impact different groups, people of color, disabled people, Republicans, Democrats, and so I think we're going to be finding that out even more over the next few months and years. In general, voter turnout, how can voter turnout be encouraged, and what are ways to change to suppress the vote or encourage the vote? It varies a lot. And there's the reason these can become such polarized issues, even though they're election administration. Jane has said, and maybe she can elaborate on this, that the bureaucracy in intra-American government is often considered the most boring part of the intra-American government class. But these are election administrators doing bureaucracy.
That's
what
right.
Nico is studying are the bureaucrats who are the experts doing science. And but they're actually really important. They become politicized because they matter for, in the case of the election administrators, who wins and who loses. And so that's why this is so important. But in terms of the overall evaluation, in the survey, I asked the local administrators, are you concerned that coronavirus is going to lower turnout in November? And over 60% of them said they're concerned that coronavirus is going to lower turnout in November. Not surprising. But to me, what's most interesting, and so if you're a local administrator yourself, thinking about what's the best strategy, what's the best policy to take, I went through all the things that the administrators said they were doing, and I compared them to that question. And there are two that if the administrators were already engaging in these practices to protect against COVID-19, that were associated with them being less likely to be worried about turnout. So basically, what made local election administrators less worried about turnout declining because of coronavirus? One was distancing. The ones who've already done and thought about engaging in social distancing measures at the ballot boxes are not as concerned that the turnout's going to go down in November. So if you haven't done that and you're a local election administrator, you should start thinking about distancing. We don't know yet if that will actually make turnout, affect turnout, but those who are doing it are not concerned about it as much. And then those who also are already making steps to hire more election workers, they are not as concerned that turnout's going to go down in November. All the other strategies that I've talked about and that we've talked about today, those had no impact on their attitudes on voter turnout. But distancing, social distancing, and hiring more poll workers seem to be right now at the local level associated with less concerns about turnout going down.
Okay, great. Thank you. We are over our limit, and I would like to thank all of you for participating. There's still a couple hundred people on the line, so thank you for participating. Please do send questions, comments, suggestions for additional webinars that you would be interested in. I'd like to thank Christian Grose, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations, for Nico Napolio, graduate student in the department, to Amber Miller, and to Dornsife Communications for organizing this. Please stay tuned, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks, everyone.